Get started now. Just to introduce myself, for those of you who may not know me, I am Paul. I work at the British Red Cross, and I am a GIS analyst here in London. So today is just taking you through how to create like simple Excel dashboards, which you can kind of easily create using any data that you have within Excel. So completely offline. Cool. I think I will start as it is a couple of minutes past. Cool. So here we go. So I thought I'd go through what are Excel dashboards first before we actually run through a practical kind of exercise. You should have already been shared some a Word document and Excel with some sample data. So if you want, you can try and do it as we go along. However, I'm going to go kind of slightly fast. What are Excel dashboards? So Excel dashboards basically what any other like business intelligence software or like dashboarding tool will do. It will take a data set, you'll then transform it, and then after you've transformed it, you can then create dashboards which are either a single kind of sheet in Excel. You can create pages, but you can also add filters to those pages. So they could be useful for reporting, for looking at your data that you're collecting, if you're doing mobile data collection or data collection in any way. And so, yeah. So there are like 3 examples here. 2 are from Mozambique, and 1 is from a British Red Cross program. So like, why Excel dashboards? So why should you use Excel dashboards and not use other software or other tools? So I've written down like 4 points here. However, there can be more. So for me, the top points about why you should use Excel dashboards are that if you are in resource poor settings or you don't have any internet availability, then basically you can use it completely offline. You can collect your data, you can store your data in an Excel database or Excel table, and then just straight away make charts, make filterable tables, all the stuff you kind of need, which you can also get in kind of fancy software as well. So I often use them sometimes if people say, oh, I want a dashboard for this, that, and the other. I can quickly mock one up with them, sat next to them, and kind of say, is this what you want? And then possibly develop that further. Also, if during emergency scenarios, like needs change quite often, then you're not investing a hell of a lot of time in a single tool or a single process that may change or may stop because of someone's skills. Most people have kind of used Excel. So it's a tool which is approachable, and also you can share and with basically most people, because they should have Excel on their laptops. Thank you, Ashley, for sharing all the data sets. So I'm just going to roll through the Word doc. But does anyone have any questions on the past 2 slides? Otherwise, I'll just go straight in. I'll give you 5 seconds while I open up Excel. Here you go. Cool. So, let me share my screen. There we go. So a lot of times you'll get, maybe if you do mobile data collection, let me just cancel this. No. There we A lot of times you'll get data collection through like mobiles, devices, or you could be shared data from others just in an Excel format. So this training or exercise won't go through how to clean your data or make it appropriate for dashboarding. We're just going to start with a clean data set. Cool. So what I like to do, first of all, when I get a clean data set, is to save it as a new separate document and to keep it outside of the dashboard. So I mainly do this because if I make a mistake or if I accidentally change something, then I have a document that I can refer back to. So often I'll just copy and paste the raw data into a new book, so I've copied and pasted it into a new book here. The first thing that you'll need to do is, once you've created your kind of copy and paste, is to then create a table from it. But before we do this, I should probably say that the dashboard that we're trying to create is aimed for maybe like during an emergency response. So say a relief person has come to you saying, I want to know the number of households that I'm distributing to over time, and also the number of tarpaulins, blankets, kitchen sets, mosquito nets that are being distributed on those days. So thinking about those questions, we can see that we need a filter by possibly like a province or a district, and also a filter by date. So keep that in mind when we're going through this exercise. So first of all, we need to create a table. The table will allow us to then create a pivot table to transform our information. Plus, it will also allow us to then add more rows to our spreadsheet. If we add more rows when we have a table, it will automatically include them in our data set. If, however, I just create a pivot table based on rows A to S or columns A to S and rows 1 to 20, when I add in a new row on 21, it will then not be included in the data set. So let's do that now. So create a table, and there you go. You can often tell you've created a table because the design of Excel will show you that it's in a different color. You can change the color as well in the design if you want black or orange or gray or yellow. I'll stick with blue. So the first thing I'm going to do is, once I've created my table, is to name the table. So I'm going to call this table relief 1. You can call the table what you want in the top left. However, I like to keep table because it's a table, relief because it's about relief data, and 1 just in case there are other tables that I'm creating. Cool. The reason I'm naming the table, you'll soon see later on when we add in filters. Cool. So once we've created a table, I then want to create additional sheets. I'm creating a sheet for the table that I'm working in. I'll call that table relief. I'll create another sheet called pivot relief, because we are going to transform our data. And then lastly, I'm going to create one called dashboard relief. So this is where our dashboard will go. So I just want to check that everything in my table has been copied across correctly. I can see that the dates are in Excel kind of format. I want that to be as a date format, so I'm going to change that to date. And then I can see everything's copied across nicely. So next stage, create the pivot table to transform the data so that I can have, the original ask was like number of households reached over time. So I want a date filter, a date field, and I also want a column showing the number of households on that date. You can see here that there are several which were done on the 5th of July, 2020. I did choose a date in the future so that no one would know that this is, so that you'll know that this is kind of fake data, and it's not real data. So let's do this. Let's create a pivot table. So you can see it uses a pivot table and it says select table, table relief _1. I'm going to use that in an existing worksheet. Let's go to pivot relief and I'm going to click here and click OK. Boom. Cool. So now in the pivot relief tab, I've inserted my pivot table. Before I am going to assign rows, I'm going to rename my pivot table. I'm going to name this pivot relief 1, and I'm also going to name it up here pivot relief 1. You're going to see later on why this is important. You just have to trust me that you do it early on, and then you'll see that when we assign filters, the filters will be assigned to pivot tables. So if you have 20 pivot tables, I don't want it to be called pivot table 1, pivot table 2, pivot table 3, because I won't know what pivot table I'm referring to. It will all be clearer later on. So let's add our pivot table. So we want the number of households reached over time. So the date will go in the row column and the sum of households will go in the values column on the pivot table fields kind of dialog box. Cool. So the next step is to first create our where we want to first edit our dashboard tab. So say the delegate asked or staff member asked for, I want an A4 sheet of pieces of paper that I can filter and print. You can do this within Excel. So in the bottom right hand corner next to where it has the zoom in out buttons, the second kind of button across says page layout. If you click on page layout, your Excel sheet will now look like A4 pieces of paper. If I zoom out even more, you can kind of see this. And basically when you print, it will print on these A4 pieces of paper. You can have this in a sheet type view where you have the lines going down. So between I and J, you can kind of see the dashes, and that's like a page and up to row 50. However, for me personally, I like to use this kind of view if I'm creating a dashboard which I want to be printable, just because it's easier for me to work on, and it's easy and it's more understandable for the person who I'm handing over to. So first of all, I'm going to reduce the size of the cells on my page, just because I want a bit more flexibility when I'm adding in charts and tables, for instance. So on this piece of paper, I want to add a chart that says the number of households reached over time. To do this, we can, hopefully you will know that you can insert a chart. However, there is also something called a pivot chart. So a pivot chart is exactly the same as kind of a pivot table, or exactly the same as a normal chart, but it's kind of built around the pivot table kind of concept. So if you filter a pivot table, the pivot chart will also change. If you add more rows to your table at the very beginning, you update your pivot table, it will then also update your pivot chart. So it's not linked to a set number of cells. So it's exactly the same concept of why we had a table and not just cells which are filled in Excel. So we want to make this look nice. So I'm going to essentially remove what is a total. I'm going to remove these ugly boxes. But just to note, you can filter here by dates if you wanted to. So this is basically what we are going to do by adding in filters later on. But first, let's select all. We're going to remove all of these. So we're going to hide them. We are then going to add in axes. So we have date at the bottom. Then we have number of households on the side. Just because it's red cross, let's just make it red. Cool. So as we did before with naming the tables, naming the pivot tables, we're also going to name our chart. Another benefit of naming is that if you hand over an Excel file, you can then essentially write down as you go, like in the cells here. So in A1 and A2, I've written down pivot relief 1 and chart relief 1, just to identify that the chart is associated with that pivot table, or that pivot table is associated with that table. So let's copy and paste this into our dashboard here. Let's paste that in here. And let's kind of put it down here. So one thing that was requested from this dashboard is that we filter by both area and by date. We can do this by adding slices. So slices are essentially the Excel term for filters. If you go to the analyze at the top of the page, the sharing screen has just covered that for me. Then under where review is, it says insert slicer. If we click insert slicer, we then get a pop-up and we can insert slices. So it's basically asking, how would you like to filter your data? So I want to filter my data in the end by province, by district, and by date. If I click OK, I now have, let me zoom in slightly, 3 what are called slices. So slices basically filter your data set. So let me move these out of the way so I can show you what they do exactly. We can make it look slightly nicer in a moment. So now, hopefully, if you can all see, if I now click, I only want to care about households reached in province 1. If I click province 1, my chart will now change. It's only showing the number of households which have been reached in province 1. I can then also add province 1, district 1, and then it will change again. If I want province 1, district 1, and only on the 3rd of July, I don't know why we would do this because you can see it already, but it will then filter that again. So it's now, your date has now, your chart has now changed. We can then clear the filters by clicking the clear filter button at the top right. But we can also select multiple. So either you can drag and then you can select 2 provinces, for instance, or you can select this multi-select button where then it allows you to select multiple in your slicer. Cool. You can also change the styling of your slices. If you click on the slicer and you go to the options at the top, you can select slicer styles. So you can select ones which you can change the color from orange to gray to yellow to blue to green, or you can create your own. Because I've made several Excel dashboards in the past, I have created kind of like my own kind of style, as in reducing the size of fonts just to make it all kind of fit into a single page. But if you want to do this yourself, you can right click, you can then go here, you can create a new slicer style, and basically you can kind of create your own. So let's make this dashboard look a bit nicer before we move on. Let's kind of do this. Let's make this there. Let's have filters up here. Let's change the style of these. And let's make them all inline. A tip in Excel for making everything in line with the cells that you have is using the Alt key on a kind of Windows PC. I don't know about Macs. If you click Alt, it will then snap to the cells. So let's just do this quickly. There we go. Then let's add another heading here. For number of households reached, number of households reached. There we go. Now, because I've got a title up here, do I need a title down here? Maybe not. So sometimes you can keep in this title, sometimes you don't have to. We can remove that because I don't see the need of it. So this is great to show a chart. However, what if I'm concerned about the exact number? Do I want to add up all of these dates? Possibly all of these dates, all of these households? Possibly not. So I would like to now have a number, possibly right in the middle here, of the exact number of households reached that are displayed in this chart. A benefit of using a pivot table is that if I click equals here, because I want to show a number, and then if I click the grand total here, it will always now get the grand total of the sum of households. So this should now say 4785. It does, it says 4785, which is the grand total here. If I now filter again, so if I go for province 1, the number of households reached and the number here changes as well. If I then click district 1, it changes again. Cool. So now we're going to do something else. So one of the original asks, perhaps, was that this person who we're delivering this dashboard to would like to know the number of tupolins that have been distributed by exactly the same up here, by district, by province, and by date. So let's call this, first of all, key figures. And then say tupolins. So in order to do this, we need to create a new pivot table because it's a new piece of data and it's a new way that we're transforming our initial table. We're creating a new pivot table. So we go back to our table, we insert a pivot table, existing worksheet, and then we go back here into our pivot relief sheet, click OK. Ooh. Let me move this out of the way. As we did before, we then want to rename our pivot table. So I'm going to call this pivot relief 2. And I'm going to put up here pivot relief 2, so we know that we're talking about this pivot table. We then want to know the number of tupolins which have been distributed. So at this point, I only want to have this number here. Why don't I want the date or any other rows or any other figures? Because we don't need them. So the filter that we're going to apply is going to be on the dashboard relief tab, and it's going to be on our dashboard. And these filters and these slices will ultimately drive this this pivot table. So if we go back to our dashboard, I'm going to merge and center cells. I hate doing this, but just in case it doesn't fit. So we want equals tuplins here. So now the number of tuplins is shown in the key figures kind of box. However, let me zoom out slightly. Let me make it full page. So now, now if I filter by province, the chart changes, the numbers change. But if you look, the number of tuplins has not changed. But I want this to change. So how do we do this? In order to do this, we need to link the filter or slicer to the pivot table. To do this, we right-click province. We go to report connections here. And then as you can see, we have a new dialog box which says that this filter is only going to filter anything that's in pivot relief 1. We then click pivot relief 2. So this is why it's important to name your tables and name your pivot tables, is that if you had 20 pivot tables, then you have no idea what you were essentially filtering by. By naming it, you can then say that pivot table 2, I want to be filterable. Pivot table 3, I don't, because it might be on a completely separate dashboard. So I'm now going to click OK. So once we've done this, if I click province 1, all the numbers have now changed, and the tuplins are now 4016. But I have to do this for every single slicer, because if I click district 1 here, it doesn't change. So let's quickly do this now. Pivot relief 2 here, and report connections, pivot relief 2 here. Cool. So this is now almost finished dashboard. What I like to do is to add a header. Let me bring this in. Where I then add in, say, country, and then say relief dashboard. You can then also, if you want a logo or an image, you can then also go to design. You can then add in a picture, and then you can look for a picture online, so you can then get the IFRC logo if you wanted to. But yeah, I see quite a few people are on the chat and asking questions, but that is in essence the how you can create a dashboard in Excel, and then you can quickly print it. One thing to note, which is highly, highly important that sometimes people forget, is that if you add new data to your spreadsheet, in order to update the pivot tables, which then update all the charts, you must remember to refresh. You must remember to refresh your data, and you can do this by clicking data and then refresh all. I've seen some dashboards where they've created a macro and a button where you click just refresh. However, for some people, that can be a bit intimidating if they see a macro-enabled workbook, or sometimes it doesn't allow sharing via email if you have tight security. Also, something else to note is that if I add, for instance, a province 4 here, just to show an example, province 4, enter, you can see it's added to the table. I click refresh all. In the filters, it will also add there. So it will automatically add your data. It's coming up as blue because it doesn't have any data associated with it, because I've just added in province 4. But say I want to delete that because I realize it's wrong. Delete it, refresh all. Again, what you will see is that province 4 is still there. So you can go into, for instance, the slicer settings. You can also name your slices, where then you can, let's see, show items deleted from the data source, and it will then remove it. Cool, so that's kind of how to make a dashboard in 20 minutes. Cool.
Thanks, Paul. I
see
think
that there are
in the
questions
chat,
coming up
Dan
on
had
the
just asked a
chat,
question about
but I'll
filtered data.
answer them. So Dan has asked, for the sum of households, if you filter on the data, does the grand total still work? It looks like he was referencing the absolute cell. Filtering on a date would change the number or rows in the pivot table and mess up the reference if you filter on a date. Okay, that's a good question. So if you filter on a date, what you'll see is that everything's changed, and on the pivot, you can see 277, 277 here. So what it does is the slicer doesn't look at the absolute cell, it changes it, kind of. So it still says A8, which is here. So it's basically looking at the row total, so sum of number of households, rather than 1211, or rather than B12, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question? It was very badly explained. So for instance, if I have all of these, let me zoom in so you can kind of see the number, 3420. 342 is here. It says it's in B15. Here, it says it's in A8, which is the title of that column. So even if you filter, okay, cool. Even if you filter, it knows it's a pivot table. It automatically does that for you. Cool. Is there any more questions that people have that they would like to answer?
Yeah, I think we are trying to keep this within the shorter time frame. If there's maybe one more question, we can squeeze it in, or
any more questions? In the piece of paper in the Word document at the end, I've also included some other like possible formulas that you might want to do. So say, for instance, I don't want the filters on my piece of paper. I just want, say, date. What you can do is you can do a calculation of, for instance, the maximum and the minimum, and then you might get a date, like a date range. So you can go equals max, and then, for instance, you can then have these, and then it will give you the max date. Obviously not showing properly. There are lots of tips and tricks that you can kind of use. Yeah. You have like end date, for instance. Any more questions? I know I've run through that very quickly. Oh.
All right, I think.
Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think you.
Ashley said, I think you have your sound off.
Can you hear me? Okay, Jill can hear me. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Yeah. So cool. If you have any other questions or anything that you want to kind of discuss, feel free to email me. My email is paulknight@redcross.org.uk. But yeah, I will leave it there. There's lots of great resources out there. If you want some dashboards shared with you, then sure, I can send some across. Cool. I will stop sharing my screen now, and thank you everyone for joining.